Cheers, Rockets fans. Welcome to The Locker Line, an exclusive podcast from the home of the Rockets.
Whoa!
Sports Talk 790.
Rockets!
The Locker Line is proudly served to you by Carbox Clutch City Lager.
It is good!
Oh, yeah? Red Nation, get ready. Get ready. The Locker Line starts now.
Welcome aboard.
Welcome in to another new episode of The Lager Line, as always served to you courtesy of Clutch City Lager of Carbach Brewing. I'm Ben Dubose, your host, editor of USA Today's Rockets Wire, and contributor to Sports Talk 790, the official flagship radio station of your Houston Rockets. I'm joined as always by my good friend, co-host, and producer out of Portugal, Paulo Alves, who you can follow on Twitter/X at Paulo Alves NBA. Me, I'm at Ben Dubose. So as we chat this Friday, February 16th, it hasn't been a great couple weeks since we last recorded. The Steven Adams deal back on the 1st was the only trade the Rockets made at the deadline. And while I do think we're both understanding as to why the Rockets are still in the relatively early stages of a rebuild, there's no reason for Rafael Stone to bid super aggressively and give away future draft assets like they're candy. At the same time, for a team that started 13-9 and 15-12, and at one point had a very realistic path to the Western Conference Play-In tournament, to watch it all fall apart and not pick up any reinforcements for this season, it's at least fair to be a little underwhelmed and a little frustrated. Since that 13-9 start, the Rockets are just 11-21 over their last 32 games. That's a win pace of just 28 games for a full season. They lost 5 of their last 6 heading into the All-Star break, including a demoralizing loss Wednesday in Memphis, where they trailed by 23 points after barely more than a quarter of basketball. Just absolutely horrendous against a Grizzlies team that's ravaged by injuries. They had lost 9 straight going in, and yet it didn't matter. Now, the Rockets did fight back, and they briefly took a lead in the fourth quarter, but it was generally the same story that we've seen play out quite a few times of late. Nice attempt at a comeback, a fake comeback, as I've seen some put it on social media, but in the end, the original hole just too large to reasonably dig your way out of. And even if you do temporarily climb out of it, you expend so much energy in the comeback that you're probably not going to be able to finish it off. So with this loss, the Rockets, they're now 24-30, and they're about 3 games back of the Warriors for number 10 in the Western Conference and the final play-in tournament spot. As of Thursday night, ESPN's Basketball Power Index gave them just a 1.9% chance at the play-in, and 36-46 is their projected final record. Now, that's still well above the preseason over-under of 31.5, but still, it's a bitter pill to swallow after how well things started. Things have definitely come a bit unraveled over the last few weeks, and all relatively quickly. Now, it's not the end of the world. Yes, the Rockets are still very young. Yes, they have a ton of key injuries at the moment to Fred VanVleet, Tari Eason, Cam Whitmore. And yeah, in the grand scheme, anything postseason related from this season should always have been viewed as a bonus. I get all of that. In the big picture, none of this is a huge deal. And yet, in the short term, it really sucks. And it's not going to get any easier for a while, because even if they do get a little bit healthier after this week off, the next 6 games have 4 on the road where they're 5-21 this season. And then of those 6 games, you've got 3 against the Suns, 2 against the Thunder, and 1 in New Orleans. To say the least, it's not ideal. Even so, though, let's start with one positive. At least this year's All-Star break comes at a really good time. Because, there's some years where the break feels annoying. You worry it can disrupt your momentum. But at this point, I think everybody involved with the Rockets, players, coaches, and even the fans, we all need some time away to try and recharge. Let's just call it a mental health break. Because, Paolo, I think we all need that right about now, right?
Man, it's been so incredibly rough. It feels like whatever buy-in that Udoka seemed to have from the players to begin the season is just completely gone. I'll add the caveat that from the players that aren't naturally defensively oriented, right? I think Jabari is still trying. I do think that I'm not sure if he's 100% from his ankle injury. He just hasn't been quite the same since. He's had some flashes, but he's majorly regressed, but I don't think it's an effort issue. Amen Thompson, there's just no stopping him when it comes to effort, but especially Jalen, and I'll add Lincoln as well. Just defensively, it's not I'll say Dylan, the effort's been sort of fine, but but offensively he's not good enough to make up for it. Or the opposite, he's not good enough defensively to make up for how bad the offense has been. And Şengün, listen, he's defensively, he's just not even putting up any resistance, with exception of the Knicks game, in which he was pretty good at. But other than that, it's just guys are driving to the rim. He's not even bothering to jump. I'm not sure if that's a Şengün being lazy thing. I'm not sure if that's a Şengün's hurt thing. I'm not sure if that's the coaching staff told him not to do it because they don't want him to get into foul trouble because of how important he is to the offense, which is struggling anyways. But everybody, the entire team as a whole, they were a very good defensive team that used that to stay in games because the offense really sucked. They just become the team whose offense really sucks and whose defense really sucks as well. And I'll throw in Dylan Brooks as a prime example of this. I don't know if he got hurt and he's not 100% back. I'm not sure if he just, he has quit on the season or whatever it is. His defense has fallen off an absolute cliff. It's not even comparable to what it was before. I don't think he's even a positive right now. If I had to say on defense, he's falling asleep off ball. He's being over eager on ball, getting blown by, and he's not making those plays, either on ball or off ball in the way he's helping. To begin the season, we looked at him play, and it felt like, okay, this guy is a paradigm changer for this team. He is a specialist that's truly elite at basically every aspect of defense, and he's completely changing this team, and he's making plays, quarter after quarter after quarter, and he paired that defensive regression with offensive regression as well from a shot selection standpoint, which I kind of understand. Like, if a team's just struggling and we can't get any offense, what are you really buying into, right? Because we know what the natural tendency is for Dylan Brooks. It's to, he thinks he's a better scorer than he actually is. And I give him credit. He was holding back when the team was winning games as a byproduct of him holding back as well, because the games were really close. The defense was keeping them in it, and you know he was being efficient because he wasn't taking those ill-advised shots. And if he did, we probably win in the last games. But as a whole, you know, I don't know how much of a mental reset the All-Star break can be in actuality compared to what we can spin a narrative out of. I mean, we can say it's the midway part of the season. It is a reset for a lot of guys. It is a few days. It's like a week, right? I'm not even sure how many days it is total.
There's an 8-day gap. They played last on Wednesday and they play again next Thursday. There's an 8-day gap. I guess a better way to look at it as a physical reset, because I think with Dylan in particular, some of those habits became a lot worse once they lost Fred VanVleet to the adductor strain. I think Fred is the one guy that he truly respected as a fellow vet, the floor general. And it feels like, especially since Fred lost, I do agree with you that ever since the oblique, he's never been all the way back defensively. He's never been as shifty as he was early in the season. But I think where it's been paired with the offense is that ever since they lost Fred, there's no one that he really respects to keep him in check, and or he feels like he needs to do too much because he doesn't trust the other guys around him as much because they haven't proven it at an NBA level. But regardless, at a bare minimum, the physical reset should help because they do anticipate having Fred back on the other side. And I think that might at least help Dylan on the offensive side. Defensively, yeah, I'm with you. I'm a little more bearish because defensively, unfortunately, I suspect it's correlated with the oblique. Although maybe Dylan heals up a little bit over the break too. I mean, that's the hope. So perhaps it's not just a mental reset. Maybe we need to frame it as mental and physical, with perhaps the latter becoming even more important.
Yeah, I think the physical reset. I think you made a really good point. I think that's more tangible, and you can point to it as like 8 days rest in an NBA season is a pretty big deal. That's like, for at the very least 4 games worth of time. But mentally, which is I think the much more important aspect of it. If we want, I mean, it's going to be tough to make the play-in. But if we are to do it, it's a lot more important that we reset mentally, because no matter how good Dylan Brooks is on defense, this team's not going to be passable defensively if Alperen Sengun doesn't give a fuck, and if Jalen Green offensively doesn't snap out of whatever he's been doing, because it's like and we've talked about this before many times across the last few seasons, it's always in bunches. It's always either brilliant or terrible. And it's with Jabari, it has been this way. It's been this way a little bit as well, but not as much. And I just don't know how they unlearn things. It seems like they're making progress, and then they just revert back to whatever it was that they were doing wrong before. And it's going to be a real test for Udoka to try and reel these guys back in, because as tough as this is to say, considering the beginning of the season that we had, it might come to a point where we might just consider tanking again. As bad as it sounds, we don't have the pick, but at some point,
the top 4 protection does become relevant if you
yeah.
get to a point in which it's clearly over.
And it's not a good draft to do it. It's not a good situation with the Thunder owning your draft pick if it's 5th through 30. But it's incredible. I think it's so much of a mental thing. It's a combination of two things. Fundamentally, at the fundamentals of the game, the driving, the finishing at the rim, the shooting, the just not turning the ball over, not even looking at the advanced stuff passing wise and reading the defense things. It speaks volumes that you look at guys like Nate Williams and Nate Hinton and the guys that come off the bench from the G League, the two-way guys, that they come in and they're able to make a more positive impact than the guys that are on the floor currently. I think it's a mix of, for some reason the prospects we get are just fundamentally flawed, or their fundamentals aren't great on one side of the ball. Amen Thompson is great defensively. Offensively, for a point guard, the handle's clearly not up to par. For Jalen Green, and handling the ball is a fundamental thing for a point guard. Jalen Green is just, he cannot, he just takes awful angles when driving to the rim, and the shot seems to be broken. Jabari, it's how passive he is at times and how easily he gets shaken off of his spot. With Jabari, you can pretty easily tell if the mid-range is going to go in when he shoots it, just by the kind of shot that it is. A face-up mid-range shot is not the same thing as a fadeaway mid-range shot. For him, it's completely different. And you can go down the list. I think Tari and Cam Whitmore are kind of exceptions to this. Shingun, obviously, defensively, all of the fundamental stuff, he's not at the right time. His timing's not great. He's not in the right place. He doesn't have the athletic tools, and that gets exacerbated when they're not focused. And so, when your default way of playing the game has these flaws, when things start to go wrong, it's very easy to forget about the effort that you're putting in to execute on these fundamentals and go and revert back to what your form was under Silas. Because improvement on anything in life is about consistently doing it throughout a period of time until that becomes the default. And we did it for a few months, but that's not enough to erase 3 years of Silas for some of these guys. And also all of the things that they did beforehand. 3 months might seem like a long time in any activity to consistently do the right thing and have it become a habit. In basketball, they have too much to learn for 3 months to be enough. And it's, as I said, it's a mental thing. They need to keep making the effort to make those strides. And listen, I wish we were a couple of games closer to the play-in, so Ime could, more easily get these guys to buy in again. Because if it was a problem of these guys are just not capable of being better, or the system's broken, then you could point to the coach. And offensively, the system isn't great, but you could point to the coach. You could point to guys just not being good enough. When it's mental, and you can apply this to playoff teams as well. When the issues become mental is when you need to start thinking about making major changes. Because guys as long as people are in the right frame of mind, guys can get better. If the system's the problem, you can change the system, you can change coaches, you can change a lot of things. But when people start losing faith and people start, not losing that competitive fire that is making them get better that's when you need to change the situation completely, and that's when you have to trade a guy. If things continue this way, that's when you have to trade a guy like Jalen. Either that or significantly decrease his role to change the dynamics of the team next year. There was a drastic change this offseason, and we saw the results that it produced as far as guys buying in. I guess I would have hoped, and I know I've been we're rambling for a while, but I guess I just would have hoped that that buy-in would have lasted a little bit longer. And it is a little, and with young teams, we've mentioned this before the season, it's really easy for it to slip up and just come crashing down. There's multiple teams every year, multiple young teams every year that are transitioning from a rebuilding phase to a trying to win phase that start off hot and then something goes wrong. Either they just stop, they just start losing games, or someone gets hurt, or I don't know, a few referee decisions go the wrong way, or they have a really tough stretch in the season where they're playing a lot of contenders and they get on a losing streak and it just gets derailed. The New Orleans Pelicans have had good starts to the seasons with this, Zion Ingram centric rebuild, and they've always been deemed to have the talent but not be able to put it together because that transition is so hard. And even when you start well, just a stretch of bad games can completely derail the season from a mental standpoint. I think that's what's happened with the Rockets. I think the Suns, before getting Chris Paul, they had and before riding the bubble momentum into the season, they had seasons where they started off really hot and then eventually fell apart. I think the Timberwolves are another example of this off the top of my head, and this just happens to young teams constantly. And the fewer years that you waste trying to make that leap and failing and changing something, trying to make the leap, it starts well, it goes poorly, or it starts poorly and never starts going well throughout the season, and you make a change. The fewer years you waste out of those rookie contracts that are insane value, out of those, even if it's a max extension before it's a supermax extension, the fewer years you spend doing that, the less people are going to have to get fired, and it's usually head coaches or GMs. The fewer years you waste out of those value contracts while these guys are on their rookie deals, and the less assets you have to spend, trying to tailor the team or change the team around. And the more you can be something like the Celtics, where they started being good so young that
It's
after
just
being
ingrained.
yeah, and after becoming good, it seems like they can be good for a really long time because, listen, Jason Tatum and Jalen Brown are still incredibly young. I think they're, what, 24, 25, or 26 years old. They'll be in their primes, and I mean, nowadays, at the very least, until they're 32. And so the Celtics have a ton of time to work with to go get that championship. If guys start, if guys only get into competitive situations, kind of like Zach LaVine, for example, by the time they're 25, now the Bulls, thought they had a star in Zach LaVine, right? He looked like a star. I mean, he's already 28 or 29 years old. The time goes by quickly when guys get into competitive environments too late.
Yeah.
I don't want to overreact. It's way too early. If this is what's going to happen to the Rockets, this is still year one of that process. But it just goes to show how important it is that that Ime gets these guys back on the same page. I'm not confident that he'll be able to. This season may just be gone at this point. But if he can't, I do think that spells the end for Jalen Green and as a Houston Rocket. I think he would. I think he will get traded because the Rockets will need to shake something up and trade for and go try and get a star. But if
And
not that, because we never know if an opportunity like that is going to present itself. At the very least, as a starter, I think it maybe it's if the Rockets can turn this around, and even if it's not him playing well, team success can buy him some more time as well. But listen, I've told you guys multiple times. I'm someone that more than anybody else wants to see Jalen succeed. For reference, when I started out doing Rockets commentary and analysis, Jalen Green versus Evan Mobley was my first. I'm not gonna call it claim to fame because I'm neither famous nor was that big of a deal back then. But the first debates that I started having with personalities on Rocket's Twitter, like Itzamar, like Jackson, that everybody loves, when I first started out, was the Jalen versus Mobley debate, and I was really passionately pro Jalen back then. So I do have a lot of emotional ties to Jalen being successful. So I'm not saying this happily. I would much rather it be the opposite. But right now, it's just looking really rough. It just keeps proving time and time again that even if you see progress, it will inevitably be reversed at some point. And that's just the most frustrating type of player. Even if even if if you could lower the highs and heighten the lows and have that gap be a little bit smaller at this point in his career, early on, first couple of years, you want to see the really high highs, even if it comes with really low lows. As you go into your third, fourth year, that's when you want to see, a little bit more consistency so you can feel like you're building towards something. And with Jalen, it's frustrating because it just doesn't feel that way.
No, absolutely not. And I think Ime Udoka hinted at that in his post-game press conference from Memphis. I'll get to that in a minute, but I do want to underscore something you were saying about how thin the margins are, because at 24 and 30, as bad as this feels, an important bit of perspective, and in some ways it may make it all the more frustrating, but the Toronto game and the Memphis game, those are two on the road where I know the Rockets have been dreadful outside of Houston all year, but if you just win those two games, the Rockets are 26 and 28, and we're having an entirely different conversation. And somehow, not only did they not win both, they lost both to really bad teams. And what makes it all the more frustrating is that in both cases, they had an extended period of the game where they were good enough talent wise to outscore the opponent by 20 ish points. It's just because they took the game so unprofessionally from the outset, the hole was just too big to climb all the way out of. And it speaks to just something not being right with that starting unit, just the approach to the game, being ready. And it's frustrating. It may be too late to resolve it now. But the frustrating thing, and I guess there's a limited amount of consolation in that you really are this close to having a very different conversation about this team. If you could just flip those two results, forget everything else, just flip those two results against bad teams, and we're having a very, very different conversation about the state of play at the All-Star break. But I think seeing it happen a second time, that Memphis one, it seemed to be something of a breaking point for Ime. And I think his post-game press conference was really fascinating that it felt like he was hinting at some of those dynamics that you just laid out. In fact, he clearly suggested that he's going to think not just after the season, but over this 8-day All-Star break about potentially changing the rotation, even the starting lineup. I'm going to read you his quotes as relayed by Jonathan Fagan of the Chronicle, beat writer who was in Memphis, and then I'm going to make sure we're on the same page as far as what Ime seems to be suggesting, and then we'll talk a little bit more about our opinions as we close out the pod. Here's what Ime said, and the question from Jonathan was about building that 23-point deficit in the first 15 or so minutes of the game. If you recall, the Grizzlies had hit 5 3-pointers in like the first 3 minutes. Just a very unprofessional approach, especially on the defensive end. Ime's quote, "It's been that way for a while now. Maybe we underestimated the competition, but we came out like the softest team in the fucking league. It's definitely a concern, a problem. Maybe I have to look at the rotation and the lineup I have out there starting and try to get 5 competitors out on the court at one time to avoid poor starts like that." Now, regarding Jalen Green, who scored just 4 points in that game and did not play at all in the final 18 minutes, Ime went on to make it clear that he's at least part of the issue. Here's the quote when Ime was asked about taking out Jalen. "I'm never really concerned with the offense and taking the right shots. It's a lack of defending, not getting loose balls, rebounds, help side defense, all those little things. But it wasn't just him. It was quite a few others as well." So for me, and Paolo, you can correct me if you think I'm wrong, but the far and away most likely thing to change, if you take Ime at his word that he is genuinely considering one, then the most likely thing to change would be Jalen's spot in the starting lineup. And I'm not saying it necessarily should. I think there are clearly pros and cons, and we can get into that later. But for now, I just want to dive in a little bit more on Ime's quotes and look at what's actually being considered internally. Keep in mind the specific language that Ime used. Softest team in the league. Try to get 5 competitors out on the court. The way I look at the starting lineup, which has been the same all year when they're healthy, I don't think he's talking about Fred or Dylan. Those are guys who specifically targeted this past offseason in large part due to how competitive they are. They're leadership and culture guys. You gave them big contracts because of that. Now, I'm not saying they're perfect players. With Dylan specifically, as you just referred to, his shot selection has definitely gotten worse of late. He has not been as good defensively since the oblique injury, but I certainly don't think he's a guy that's getting called out for being soft or not competing. And again, as far as Fred, the expectation is that he will be back from the adductor strain after the All-Star break, and he's generally been a very good player when he's played. Then you have Alperen Şengün and Jabari Smith. Those are more interesting cases. With Şengün, you can certainly make the argument that he's soft at times. He is. And especially over the last month or so, I do think there's been some slippage defensively. But Ime is not dumb. The gap on offense between Şengün and whoever you could conceivably replace him with, I guess Jeff Green or Jock Landale, it's just massive. And it's also not like those guys are part of your long-term blueprint. And that's where it goes back to what we've said throughout this season. This is not truly win now. Ime knows that. There's just no way it makes sense to make Alperen Şengün a sixth man with this roster. Now, as far as Jabari, he's shooting barely above 28% from three over his last 13 games. He has not been as good as he was earlier in the season. I suspect the two ankle sprains have been a big part of that. Maybe he heals up over the All-Star break. It's fair to acknowledge there's been slippage there as well. But I just don't personally think that's a spot being questioned either. For starters, even in that Memphis game where he wasn't shooting well, Jabari was still out there down the stretch of that game. I also don't think anybody would say he's not a competitor. Jabari definitely plays with an edge to him. I guess you can say he's a little light. And while he is stronger, a lot stronger than he was as a rookie, there's still matchups where he gets pushed around. He's not a finished product. The criticisms are fair. You laid out some of them earlier as well. Definitely needs to shoot better, get stronger, get more fluid. We know all of that. But I just don't think that Ime views him as soft or not competing. And then beyond that, there's the same question as is the case with Şengün. Who would you replace him with? Even if the Rockets are lucky enough to get Tari back this season, and at this point, I don't think it's a given. Unfortunately, Ime did acknowledge that some of the pain in his leg came back when Tari tried to ramp up activity over the road trip. But even if Tari is somehow able to come back over the or after the break, I think he's probably 15 to 20 minutes per game at best. You're not going to throw him into a starter's role anytime soon. So your realistic Jabari alternatives are Jeff Green or Jae'Sean Tate, and I just don't see that as viable. Again, this is not truly a win now season. It's win now while setting yourself up for much greater winning down the line. So that just leaves one spot in the starting five, and that's Jalen. And I want to make clear, just as Ime said, I'm not trying to solely pick on him. He is absolutely not the only problem. Our last couple of pods, if you look back in our archives during that untradeable tour run just before the trade deadline when he had 29 points or more in I think 5 of 8 games, those pods were actually pretty Jalen friendly. And that run was fantastic. But the question, and you alluded to this in your comments, Paolo, it's always been about the consistency. We know the highs. Even going back to his rookie year, he had that 30-plus points per game scoring binge. He can get points in bunches. He can get hot. But the big question, and he's now 22 years old, is he ever going to get to a point where on his down nights, he's not a total non-factor? Ime clearly doesn't think he's there. That's evidenced by all the times he's pulled him this season. Wednesday's just the latest example. And even if there are all those very high highs, it's just so tough to build a consistent basketball team if the variance of one of your starters, your second leading scorer, the way this team is currently constructed, is as extreme as what we continue to see from Jalen. At this point, it's not about the highs. It's whether he can mitigate those lows and make them to where he's not a total non-factor if the shot isn't falling. And then the other thing with Jalen that's different from Şengün or Jabari is that there are alternatives, specifically with Amen Thompson and Cam Whitmore. Unlike, say, a Jeff Green or a Jae'Sean Tate, Amen and Cam actually are parts of your long-term formula. So you can still have a key long-term piece in that two-guard spot, even if you pull Jalen. That's why I think it's more viable. We should also note that both Amen and Cam have gotten a lot better in recent weeks, and they do have some advantages relative to Jalen. They're bigger, and with Amen specifically, I think it's fair to say he's already more disruptive defensively, much better as a team defender as far as knowing his rotations and whatnot. Ime did mention help side defense specifically. With Cam, his shooting has been more consistent. Now, I know some will question the floor spacing with the men and whether he can function off ball. But honestly, this recent stretch where he's played so well, if you're actually paying attention, he's mostly doing it off the ball. I know he's technically the point guard with Fred out, but when you watch, it's typically Jalen, Şengün, or even Jabari that's initiating the offense. So I actually think that putting Fred and Amen together would be fairly seamless. There's also this great chemistry between Amen and Şengün to the point where even though Amen is not a great shooter himself, he's still valuable off ball because he's such a relentless cutter, very high IQ, and Şengün has the vision and playmaking to find him. Now, none of that is to say that it's a slam dunk X's and O's decision to make this change once Fred is back as your point guard. Jalen is much more respected than Amen as a shooter, and that matters for the spacing. His one-on-one defense, well, I would give the edge to Amen. I don't think the gap is what people think. Jalen has defended at a higher level than I think he gets credit for. And then the bottom line, Jalen just has a gear offensively as a scorer that Amen can't get to right now. Now, Jalen doesn't always tap into that, but he has the potential. Amen does not. So, or at least does not right now. So with that in mind, I don't think it's a clear slam dunk decision that out of the break, you put Amen in for Jalen. Or Cam, although I think Cam's less of a consideration, not just the ankle injury, but he's a bit further behind defensively. I think Amen would get the first crack because he is so advanced defensively. He's earned a lot more trust from the coaching staff. But it's not just such a clear decision that you do it no matter what. I don't think it's inevitable. I think it's a consideration, but it could also be that Ime is just venting after some really tough losses. And then when he takes some time over the next week to think it over, he looks at the big picture and says, it's not worth it, or at least not yet. Maybe he waits until training camp for next season. There's a ton of mental and intangible factors that you've got to consider when making a decision of that magnitude. And I'll get into that in just a little bit when we talk about whether the Rockets should do this. But in terms of what he's suggesting, at least as a possibility, to me, it's the Jalen spot that's in question. And Paolo, it's worth noting that multiple times in our archives, you've made the case yourself for why the All-Star break is potentially the right time to make a change of that significance if you were ever going to make one during the season. This is the only time you've got more than a week to get your players used to something like this. You can mentally and physically prepare them. You can go through actual practices with the new groupings. Again, none of that's to say the Rockets clearly should or will make that change. I think there are pros and cons. But in terms of what Ime is actually hinting at, to me, the reference is clearly to Jalen. Paolo, did you see it the same way?
It's rough because I read the quote on Twitter, and I did not get the full context of what you just read. You mentioned the rebounding in specific, right? And after a game like the Grizzlies, if the rebounding is something that's immediately on his mind, you have to wonder if you have to look at the guys that struggled to rebound during that game, right? In specific. Mm-hmm. And so looking at it, Amen had 12 rebounds. So it's obviously not. Let's just look at the starters. Dillon Brooks had 10 rebounds as a small forward. He's definitely not who he's referring to. Jabari had 11. So, that's above his season average. That's really good for a power forward. Amen obviously had 12. And then you have Jalen with 3 in 23 minutes, which is a bit different. Like he would get probably, if he played his usually 30 something, he'd probably get to 5 or 6. Yeah. He's making a concerted effort. And then you have Alperen Şengün at 5 on 34 minutes. And that can be a strategy thing, right? That can be, they're telling, hey, Şengün, you're not exactly the lengthiest guy, box out and let, these athletes around you grab the rebounds.
And they have blitzed a little bit more with him the last couple of games, so that may be playing a small factor in it.
Yes. But then you look at it, Dillon Brooks has 10 rebounds. It's not like you're boxing out for him. If you have two guys, going for rebounds vertically and the rest of them boxing out, Dillon Brooks is very much one of the ones that's boxing out. And so, not to say that he was talking about Şengün, not to say that he's thinking of benching Şengün. I don't think he is at all, because he's not dumb. He knows he already struggles on defense without Alperen Sengun. What would this defense be? This offense be? But I do think that a big part of his criticism, as far as playing soft and the rebounding and defense, was to Sengun.
Yeah, I think it's both of them. It's just that Sengun is so indispensable offensively that they've got to put up with it. With Jalen, they don't.
So yeah, I do agree. I think if he were to bench someone, it would be Jalen. But I do want to play devil's advocate here for some of the other guys. The first one is Sengun. Obviously, you shouldn't bench him. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying the criticism is directed at these players. I think Alperen Sengun is definitely, taking a massive step backwards, both on offense and on defense. I mean, to be fair, I will bring this back. In the last 10 games, Alperen Sengun is at 17 points, 9 rebounds, and 5 assists per game. This compared to his, 21, 9, and 5 on season average, right? And this is the season average, including these 10 games. And then efficiency-wise, he's at 57% true shooting compared to his season-long, I think, 59, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, 59. And this is, once again, considering these 10 games. It will probably jump up to like near 60 without them. So this to say, Alperen Sengun has been a part of the problem the last few games. And while early on in the season, his defense was good enough for the offense to make up for it, the defense has massively regressed, and the offense has regressed a little bit. It's not that much, but it is something. It is 3 points per game. It is 2 true shooting percentage points. So I do want to mention that Alperen Sengun has been a part of the problem of why the Houston Rockets have regressed recently. Obviously, to Sengun's credit, he's just getting double teamed a lot more, and the Rockets don't have the spacing currently. Especially while playing Jason Tate and Jeff Green to make up for it, and Jalen Green's poor shooting numbers, and Jabari regressing as well. The shooting hasn't been great. Teams have figured out that they can just double Sengun and they won't get punished. So it's not all Sengun's fault, but his effort on defense certainly is, and it's fallen off a cliff recently. And I mentioned this on Twitter earlier on, a couple of 2 or 3 games ago, where I said I could very easily pick up just one game and put together a James Harden, level defensive lullaby drill of just plays that he takes off, plays that he doesn't even bother jumping, plays that he doesn't move towards the ball handler who's driving to the rim. That's a part of the problem. But he's not getting benched. He's the best player on the team. Doesn't matter. The other guy that I was going to mention is actually Dillon Brooks. And when we've talked, I have already talked about, this very podcast, how his defense is massively regressed and his shot selection has massively regressed as well. It's not like, you could sub him, Amen Thompson for him as well. It's just rough to sub him. It's just rough to take him out of the starting lineup because he is one of the best shooters on the team. Funnily enough, complaining about his offense, but he is still a 40% shooter thus far this year. But the other thing that I wanted to mention is there was a weird interaction on the broadcast, the Rockets broadcast last game, where there was a timeout and Craig mentioned that some coach. This correct me if I'm wrong. Maybe I didn't interpret the interaction correctly, but Craig was talking about how one of the coaches was yelling at Dillon because of the shot selection or whatever it was, and Ryan was somewhat surprised and said, "Wait, what? You're talking about Dillon Brooks?" And I was like, "Huh. Usually they're not this, polar opposites when talking about something." Which makes me think that Craig's seeing this as well. Dillon's just massively regressed on both ends, and maybe Ryan is still holding on to the reputation of what Dillon Brooks is, at least defensively, a little bit too much. But it goes to show how it's very possible to have both takes, to just disregard Dillon criticism because of his reputation, or call it out.
Based on what's happening in a given game.
Exactly. So if Craig sees it, I'm sure Udoka can see it too. Although Dillon's minutes haven't really taken a hit, so I don't know if that's the case. But I just wanted to play devil's advocate and say that yes, Jalen's the obvious change, and if he has to make one, it will be Jalen. I think you can argue whether that should be Amen Thompson or Cam Whitmore. or even somebody else. Reggie Bullock, Nate Hinton. What's the other Nate that I'm forgetting?
Nate Williams.
Nate Williams, right. All of these guys could, step in and play the role that Jalen's playing and probably do a better job, at least, simplifying the offense and providing, an actual plus on defense. So it is interesting that the way, Ime Udoka framed it, and he is, severely pissed off about how this team's playing, which is good. But I just don't know what you do at this point that's going to change the overall dynamics. Even if you bench Jalen, I'm not sure that's enough to get the other guys to lock in that need to lock in as well, especially Shingun. I kind of, it's radical, right? I kind of wish he'll just, just one game, just reverse it. Have the bench start.
Ooh, I like this.
And bring these guys off the bench. Just humiliate them. You got the backing from the front office. If Ime goes down, the front office is very much going down with him. And that's the biggest wake-up call that you can get.
Yeah.
And if they get pissed, and if they get pissed off, what are they going to do about it? They're on rookie deals. The guys closest to getting off of them have 1 more year of contract, and after that are restricted free agents. Those guys don't move. You have all of the authority to do something crazy like that, and I just kind of wish you would do it. And if for nothing else, have Nate Williams, have Nate Hinton, way above these guys. Have them come off the bench and play bench minutes. I think if there was someone to make a brave move like that, it would be Udoka. Whether it would do more harm than good, I don't know. But I think it's worth attempting because they do need a massive shakeup.
Well, at that point, an advantage to it would be that you're not scapegoating just one guy. You're making it clear that it's about the collective, which he tried to do in those post-game comments when he was asked about Jalen specifically. He acknowledged problems, but he then, tried to hedge and point out that it's not like this is just a Jalen problem. There's several. It's just, conveniently, we all know that Jalen is the easiest on paper. Funny that, Rafael had that quote about Jalen's a great fit with us on paper. It feels like we're sort of saying the same thing now in a very different context. On paper, he's the easiest to change. Yeah, I'm very much torn on whether it's actually going to happen because from where I sit, again, you can make the argument. I don't think it's an open and shut case either way, but gun to my head, based on what I know, and I admit I don't have all the information, I don't think I would do it. As frustrating as it is, at least when I'm talking about benching Jalen specifically, which is the way I think most people took that quote. So, in terms of the reasons why I don't think I would do it, although I am at least somewhat open-minded to it, it's not been a good year for Jalen. Let's just be honest. One argument I want to deconstruct right off the top. I've seen some suggest that, well, you should just start Jalen no matter what, because if you don't start him, you're going to tank his trade value for the offseason. I don't buy that at all. Paolo, you had a good tweet the other day about how if the Rockets want to move on from Jalen this offseason, a lot of fans might not be prepared for just how small the return is. I think that's probably going to be the case no matter what. At this point, unless he just magically turns into Shai Gilgeous-Alexander or Devin Booker on a consistent basis for the last 28 games, and I just do not think that's realistic. At some point, the inconsistency is baked in. That's just who he is at this point. And any team acquiring him, I don't think, even if he improves a little bit over the last 28 games, it's not going to be enough to dramatically change his profile. You're not going to be acquiring him based on what he did this season. You'd be acquiring him from the perspective of another team as a guy who was drafted number 2 overall less than 3 years ago. And now he's been put in this new system where everything changed. And they're going to think that maybe if we put him in our system with our coaches and use him in a different way, that we can get more out of him than Houston has. In short, it's going to be a change of scenery type bet. And those typically don't have great trade returns no matter what. So I don't think that trying to artificially prop up his trade value by letting him go out and have a few 30-plus points per game nights, I don't think that's just going to do a whole lot. At this point, his trade value is what it is, and I don't think that should really be considered. I do think that Jalen's long-term value to the Rockets should be considered. It's not about externally. I think that is what it is in terms of his perception around the league, and it's unlikely that that's going to dramatically change in the span of just a few weeks. There's going to be less than 2 months left to play once they resume play next Thursday. But in terms of Jalen's position in the organization and this debate that we've had as recently as our last couple of pods, talking about what if he still salvages this? What if this recent stretch, the untradeable tour, if you will, is really the start of something? Even if it's not likely, the possibility of a guy that you've invested so much in and clearly does have a lot of talent underneath it all, it's not insignificant. And I think if you bench just Jalen and no one else, it may be a point of no return when it comes to your relationship with him and his trust with you as an organization. And you have to consider the human factors. If this was a video game, for sure, I would start Amin over Jalen for a couple of weeks because it looks like the season is lost no matter what. I do think that Amin has higher long-term potential than Jalen does. I think most people around the NBA would come to the same conclusion. So with Amin in better form of late, if it was a video game and it's just about the basketball, feelings don't matter, culture doesn't matter, I'd say, you know what? Let's rip the Band-Aid off. Let's see what happens with the men. Let's let Jalen feast as a six man. And if it doesn't work out, whatever, we can just put Jalen back in a couple of weeks and maybe he builds even more confidence and good habits playing against backups and what have you. That's not the way it works in real life. These are human beings. And if you make it clear after years of him being the focal point of your rebuild, number 2 overall pick, that he's getting pulled not for a really good player. We're not talking about replacing him for, say, Donovan Mitchell. We're talking about replacing him for a rookie that hasn't consistently proven anything and being the only guy held accountable in that starting lineup. I do think it's fair to wonder how he would take that. Maybe he would outright ask for a trade in the offseason, or maybe it's not, maybe it never gets to that level of bitter, but it just affects his focus, his effort, his confidence. Those are very real considerations for a young player. I know some will say, well, if he doesn't accept it, then it just proves he's not mentally tough enough anyway, so you don't need him. I think that's oversimplifying. This would be legitimately hard on any player to, on the fly, ask him to be a sixth man. I will point out that last summer, Ime took the job in late April or early May, and they had, of course, informal get-togethers, conversations, practices during the offseason before everything went haywire with Kevin Porter Jr. and his then girlfriend in mid-September. The Rockets knew over the summer, and Kevin was thrown into the shooting guard mix as soon as the Rockets signed Fred VanVleet. The Rockets knew Kevin Porter Jr. was a better basketball player than Jalen Green. And yet they were still going to start Jalen Green even before Kevin Porter Jr. basically got himself banished from the NBA. Because it wasn't just about the here and now. It's also about the long term. It's about the blueprint. And they believed that Jalen was more important in the long term. They had more trust in him. They believed he had a higher ceiling. Now, I'm not saying it's an apples to apples comp. I think the Rockets have more invested in Amin Thompson than KPJ. I think they trust him more. And I also think Jalen, it's not just 2 years. Now it's almost 3 years that he's played. And if anything, he's taken a little bit of a step back this year in some ways, at least with the efficiency. Now, I know he's gotten better in other areas as well, decision-making, defense. There have been some strides, even if the efficiency metrics aren't doing him any favors. But the point is, last summer, even when there was a better option internally, the Rockets long-term said, you know what, it's not worth it to try and make Jalen a six-man. It's not worth opening that can of worms. We're going to take the longer-term view. So is it worth it to go to the other extreme now for a rookie that really has only played at a super high level for the last couple of weeks? Now, you can make the case. They do like Amin Thompson. He's more of a two-way player. And if you feel confident that no matter what, by next fall, Amin and Fred is going to be your starting backcourt, then maybe you rip the Band-Aid off and you do it. But you need to know going into it that that's potentially what you're doing. Not going to say there's no case otherwise. Maybe, a guy I've compared to Jalen a few times is Anthony Simons in Portland. He didn't start until midway through his 4th year, didn't really break out until year 5, year 6. Maybe Jalen would look to a guy like that and say, you know what, I'm not entitled to start this young in my NBA career. I can boost my efficiency as Simons did playing against backups and then, break out the next couple of years. It's not too late. In terms of the body's timeline, it's not. In terms of the typical trajectory of an NBA career, it's a lot to ask. And even with Simons, he was a mid to late first round pick, and the guy in front of him was CJ McCollum, an established veteran shooting guard. wasn't like he was drafted second overall and you were benching him midway through his third season for a rookie. So even if you want to point to some rosier scenarios and say, hey, maybe Jalen accepts it gracefully, works on his deficiencies, and earns his spot back, it's possible. I wouldn't write it off, but you shouldn't count on it. There's also some scenarios where he loses his trust with you, and whether he asks out or not, it's just pretty much the end, and you have to part ways in the offseason. So the bottom line, if you make this, and this is the last thing I'll say, if you make this change now, it can't be just, oh, this is going poorly, so I just want to look at this as a trial balloon and see what happens. If you make this change, it is basically a symbol, potentially a transformative one, of your rebuild, that you are turning the page. Now, it doesn't guarantee that that's going to happen. Maybe Jalen surprises us and takes it extremely gracefully and works his way back into form and earns trust again. But I don't think you can count on that scenario. I think history suggests that he would take it hard, especially when you've already asked him to do so much and he's learned a new system this year, a new role. He's gone through so many changes. If you make that type of decision, and he is the only one that's being held accountable, you run the risk of losing him altogether. Now, maybe that's a decision they've already made. Maybe they think it's worth it because Amen is just that good. I should point out that while, I say Jalen has shown enough this year that I still have some intrigue, the Rockets have information we don't. They see these guys on the practice court, in the film room, in the locker room. They know how these guys prepare, how they work. So it's possible, well, it's not possible, it's a certainty that we don't have all the information, and it's possible that there are factors that may tip the scales that we're not aware of. But from where I sit, if there's any hope at all of a positive long-term outcome with Jalen, I think for now, you ride it out. Maybe you can get a look at a men late in the season, because if it's clear you're not going to make the play-in tournament, then you are incentivized, as you said earlier, to sort of tank at the very end to maximize the odds of the top 4 protection kicking in on your draft pick, and that can sort of artificially give you an opportunity to run some lineups with a men at the 2, if you will. But I just think if you make that decision now, it needs to be not just because you're frustrated and trying something new. It needs to be because you are convinced either Jalen's not the guy or Amen is, and it's a decision that needs to be made on a much more permanent basis, not just a trial balloon, because there are some very real human factors that need to be considered there. And maybe Ime is ready to pull the plug and make that type of change. As you've said in the past, Paolo, the All-Star break is potentially the time to do it if you're ever going to do it during the season. But there's also a case that he's just frustrated because day-to-day over the regular season, being an NBA coach, it's very insular. You're focused every hour, every play. You want to maximize every margin. And so superficially, the Jalen hole is the easiest one to fill. Totally get it. There's also a world where over the next few days without basketball, Ime might take a step back and think of the bigger picture. One of my favorite guys in the business, I covered Mike D'Antoni for a number of years, very good coach, also a really good human being. And there were times he'd say something post-game about what went wrong, and I'd follow up a day or two later at practice or the next shoot around, and I'd say, Mike, what do you think about doing so-and-so to potentially address what he called out as a deficiency? And a couple of times he would respond to me and say, actually, no, I was wrong. That wasn't the issue. What he meant by that, he wasn't lying. It's just at the time, we all have, certain biases, certain instinct calls that we make. And in the heat of the moment, Mike thought 10 minutes after a game when he does one of these press conferences, and especially when you lose, which the Rockets have done a ton of late, the emotions are raw. But then you take a step back, you think about it more, you watch it in film with other coaches, the players, you hear other perspectives. You realize, hey, I didn't have all the right information. You walk it back, and that's part of being a good coach, part of being a good human. We all make mistakes in the heat of the moment. We all have certain biases. Sometimes we don't have the full perspective. There could be a little bit of that as well, and that, Ime's frustrated in the moment right after a game like that, but then he walks it back when he thinks a bit more. Not saying for sure that's it. There is a world where, Ime's thought about it for a while, and now we're at the All-Star break. It's just the time to make the change, and he's all in. But there's also a world where there's just a lot of frustration talking. And while that's the easy thing to do in the short term on paper, I don't think it actually makes sense to go through with it unless you have 100% or close to it made up your mind on what's going to happen with Jalen long term. Maybe they have, but if they haven't, if there's still realistic hope of a positive long-term outcome, and for me, there's at least some hope, not nearly as much as there was a few months ago, but there's some hope. I've seen some things in the last month that I've liked. then to me, the juice just isn't worth the squeeze. I think you ride it out a bit longer. And, and then it's not going to matter if you wait until later this season or even next season to start him. I mean, there's a few benefits. Sure, you let him start playing with Fred early and they can get more in sync, but Amen doesn't have a big ego. He's a rookie. If you wait a little bit longer in this season or until the fall, I don't think there's going to be any huge hit to waiting. So for me, I'm inclined to wait unless the Rockets are already at that point where they are ready and they feel confident in saying we're going to move on no matter what. Maybe they're there. I guess my closing thought, I want it to be more of a long-term decision and not something that's just emotional and reactionary to the last few games. Does that make sense?
I mean, it does, but at the same time, I don't want to be too simplistic, but it might just be a Jalen's taking this for granted a little bit. Because it does make some sense, right? He's never seemed like that type of dude in press conferences. But if he would, be hurt emotionally by the fact that he'd be benched, something's wrong either in his assessment of his own play or, in his assessment of what it takes to be a starting level shooting guard or even a star level prospect, a starting level shooting guard or a star level prospect in the NBA. Because
See,
he
I
was
disagree with you a little bit about that, given the alternatives here. As a general rule, I think you're right. But when the alternative is a rookie that hasn't done much at all, and you've already made several decisions to sort of maximize Jalen, you're asking him to get out of his comfort zone and try some new things. I think it would be a bitter pill to swallow here for a rookie in particular, either Amen Thompson or Cam Whitmore, probably Amen Thompson. That's the one distinction I would draw.
Yeah, but at the same time, it's not like you're playing better than them. My point isn't just in comparison to what the average NBA shooting guard is. He is currently not playing better than them. And as an NBA player, at any point, if you're not playing better than your backup, you run the risk of being benched. I guess he's just never had a backup that was close to it, anywhere close to as good as he is up to this point in his career. And I think it has, the number 2 overall pick shine only gets you so far. It's not like Jalen has had, some crazy accomplishments or at any point throughout his career thus far, besides, from January onwards on his rookie season, look consistently like a star prospect, like a guy that you can't bench because it would be disrespectful. What has Jalen proved thus far? He's made an all-rookie first team, but he's never been to league average true shooting. He's never been league average 3-point shooting. He's probably about league average defensively right now, but he's never been league average defensively. He's never been a positive player on the floor consistently besides his rookie season for that second half when he was playing awesome. And so at some point you've got to and it might be just as you were talking, I was realizing it might just be exactly what he needs. Because I think at this point he's taking for granted that he is a starter at the NBA level. And he might need to hit rock bottom before he realizes.
Interesting. So you're saying it might be worth just a shock to the system to where you try something that drastic and maybe the ideal outcome, he looks at a guy like, Anthony Simons is a template that I pointed out that's gone the longer route and eventually panned out and says, I can do this too. And if he doesn't do it, then maybe he just doesn't have the mental makeup that you need.
Because with Anthony Simons, as you said, he started off lower. And so he was progressing. He took the shock in the first year, and it was a justifiable one, as you said, with CJ McCollum ahead of him. But he gradually improved from the start of his NBA career going forward. For Jalen, it would be like being at the top of the world, crashing down, and trying to get back up to it. I'm not sure I can remember off the top of my head a good example of this, because I truly think that right now he might take for granted that he will always be a starter in the NBA. And the quicker you burst that bubble for him, the bigger I think then it might increase the chance that you are able to get the most out of him on a long-term play. Now,
Yeah.
it's incredibly risky to do this because he might resent whoever starts over him. It might kill team chemistry between him and whoever that person is, depending on how mature he is. So it's a massive risk. But we're at a point where if he doesn't get better, you're probably going to trade him in the offseason anyway. So you're not going to get your return on a top two pick, even down the line. Because I'm not sure he can continue this level of play and survive next offseason on the team.
Yeah.
So it might be worth it to to shock therapy this and see how it works, because when you look at it, it actually makes a little bit of sense as well, because he came in, it makes even more sense when you frame it as he came into the league and into the Rockets as this is the guy, and he has been the guy for 2 years. I mean, not exactly, not exactly on the floor, because Christian Wood was getting a lot of looks. He was being used off ball a lot early on, but from a narrative standpoint, from a face of the franchise standpoint, he was the face of the franchise from the moment he got here. And so I wonder if it has ever crossed his mind to this point that it might not work out, that he
Yeah.
might not be the face of the franchise here or anywhere else. And that shift in expectations might be something that he needs to eventually rebound and get back to possibly what we think he can be. But the
Maybe, but
sooner,
I would
yeah, go ahead.
say even in that scenario, we're sort of in alignment in that to take that risk, you have to acknowledge that the status quo probably is not going to work out. Because even if you do believe that, then you're still taking the same underlying risk of, hey, what if this goes bust and he doesn't respond as you want? The bottom line is to take that type of risk. Well, first you need to acknowledge it, and then it's about understanding that the status quo, the path he's on, is just not tenable. And so you sort of have to risk something drastic to get the longer term payoff. Maybe I was a little bit aggressive in saying that, it's 100% the end of Jalen in Houston if you do that, but you at least have to be open to a scenario where it does kill the relationship. Maybe, he does become an outlier that accepts it and learns from it and shows the requisite maturity and whatnot. I hope so. I like Jalen. He's a good kid. But I think we're sort of in alignment in that you have to understand the risk. And I guess that was my underlying point, is that if you go down this road, just make sure it's not reactionary to a few bad games. Make sure there's a longer term understanding of the risk at play when you make that kind of move.
Yeah, I do agree with you. It's an all or nothing move, and you only take and you only do an all or nothing move when you've reached the point where you don't mind losing as much. So yeah, I do think it's a tough call. I'm not saying they should do it. It is definitely a tough call. Whether you still believe that the current path will lead to him being on this team beyond next offseason, it might be worth it if you've already made up your mind and said, "Hey, listen, if he keeps playing like this, we're going to trade him this offseason. So he might as well run this risk."
Hmm.
It's not like he's going. I'm not sure. And this might be really, really drastic. I'm not sure. Next, if he keeps playing like this, next offseason the team gives up a first round pick for him.
Fair
A
question. I
future one.
mean,
A
yeah,
future one, because we all know the Rockets are not interested in one this year.
yeah,
And the last thing that I'll mention is, to the credit of my earlier idea of just starting all of the bench players. First of all, you don't target one guy, so it's a lot less likely that he'll turn against you, if it's a team punishment. And the other thing is, imagine the impact, the impact of the message you send just by doing it is one thing.
hmm,
Imagine the impact that it will have if they win the goddamn game. Same system, same system, just players that are incredibly less skilled with the same coach and the same system, just a better, mental makeup. And they won a game, and this team's been struggling to do that for the longest time.
fair.
So I think it's worth trying at least that before you make any,
Yeah.
even more drastic moves.
And we'll circle back on this next week. We'll try and get another show in the early to middle portion of the All-Star break, the second week of it. That is, I know we didn't have an episode last week. I actually had COVID, so I was taking some time off. But yeah, we'll try and double down during this break. And my guess is if we do it after they report back to practice, probably Tuesday, at the latest Wednesday, we'll have resolution, because I don't think this is a situation where the Rockets would just pull a surprise on the Pelicans and all of a sudden, ooh, they're starting Amen Thompson rather than Jalen Green. No, this is something, if you're going to make a change of that magnitude, you're going to want to sit down with these guys, talk to them about it. And of course, when the team knows, the media and everyone around them will know shortly thereafter. So my guess is if the Rockets do make a change, and Jalen's the most likely for the reasons that we've been outlining for the last hour or so, then we'll find out well before Thursday's game. They'll give us a heads up at practice that this is the direction that they're going, might even leak it to the media beforehand to try and brace people for it. And then at that point, we'll react to whatever comes out of practice and potentially any changes, that being the most likely if they do make a move. We'll also talk early next week about what didn't happen at the trade deadline, and we touched on it very briefly earlier in this show. Our last episode did actually have reaction to the Steven Adams deal, but I also want to touch on, we don't have time today, we've talked mostly about the potential changes, but also want to offer our perspective about the moves that did not get made and let you guys in on our insight, how we view what that means for the offseason, the big picture, yada, yada. Anyway, we've gone on long enough for one show, so we will break it here. We appreciate you guys so much for tuning in. And if you want more content before our next episode, the best place to get it is on Twitter. Paolo's on there at Paolo Alves NBA. I'm on there at Ben Dubose. And this show, The Logger Line, is on there at The Logger Line. Just go to twitter.com/The Logger Line. And then if you hit up the link tree at the bio, you can find the links to not just us, but all of our partners, friends, Carbach Brewing, Sports Talk 790, Rockets Wire. You can also find our distributors, Apple, Google, Spotify. If you had already subscribed to this show and left it a 5-star review, please do. We would appreciate that. And of course, by doing that, you get the benefit of episodes right as they come out. All right, that'll do it for the plugs. That'll do it for today's show. As always, thank you all for listening, and please come back soon for another new episode of The Logger Line.